Welcome back. Today we're going to be finishing section 3, the imprints of early infancy, in chapter 2, the imprints of experience, in the book Primitive Mythology by Joseph Campbell. So, a fourth constellation of imprints engraved on the maturing psyche of the infant appears, at least in those provinces of our own civilization that have been studied for these effects, at about the age of 4, when the physical difference between the sexes becomes a matter of keen concern. The petite différence leads the girl to believe, we are told, that she has been castrated, and the boy that he is liable to be. Thereafter, in the masculine imagination, all fear of punishment is freighted with an obscurely sensed castration fear, while the female is obsessed with an envy that cannot be quite quenched until she has brought forth from her own body a son. Hence the value, from the female point of view, of the Madonna image, and the whole system of religious references imputing cosmic significance to her womb and breasts. But in the male, the sense of her dangerous envy is ever present. Hence the negative estimate of the woman as a potential spiritual, if not physical, castrator, which in the mind of the child tends to become associated with the image of the ogress and cannibal witch, and in religious traditions where a monastic spirit prevails, is an extremely prominent trait. In this connection, it should be noted that there is a motif occurring in certain primitive mythologies as well as in modern surrealist painting and neurotic dream, which is known to folklore as the toothed vagina, the vagina that castrates. And a counterpart, the other way, is the so-called phallic mother, a motif perfectly illustrated in the long fingers and nose of the witch. According to Freud, the capacity of the sight of a spider to precipitate a crisis of neurotic anxiety, whether in the nursery rhyme of Miss Muffet or in the labyrinths of a modern life, derives from an unconscious association of the spider with the image of the phallic mother, to which perhaps should be added the observation that the web, the spiral web, may also contribute to the arachnid's force as a fear-releasing sign. There is a myth of the Andamanese, according to which there was at first no woman in the world, only men. Sir Monitor Lizard, whom we shall later meet at leisure, captured one of these, cut off his genitals, and took him to wife. Their progeny became the ancestors of the only race in the world with which the Andamanese and their mythology are concerned, to wit, the Andamanese. According to another myth told in New Mexico by the Jicarilla Apache Indians, there was once a murderous monster called Kicking Monster, whose 4 daughters at the time were the only women in the world possessing vaginas. They were vagina girls, and they lived in a house that was full of vaginas. They had the form of women, we are told, but they were in reality vaginas. Other vaginas were hanging around on the walls, but these 4 were in the form of girls, with legs and all body parts, and were walking around. As may be imagined, the rumor of these girls brought many men along the road, but they would be met by Kicking Monster, kicked into the house, and never returned. And so Killer of Enemies, a marvelous boy hero, took it upon himself to correct the situation. Outwitting Kicking Monster, Killer of Enemies entered the house, and the 4 girls approached him, craving intercourse. But he asked, "Where have all the men gone who were kicked into this place?" "We ate them up," they said, "because we like to do that," and they attempted to embrace him, but he held them off, shouting, "Keep away! That is no way to use the vagina." And then he told them, "First I must give you some medicine, which you have never tasted before, medicine made of sour berries, and then I'll do what you ask." Whereupon he gave them sour berries of 4 kinds to eat. "The vagina," he said, "is always sweet when you do like this." The berries puckered their mouths, and so that finally they could not chew at all, but only swallowed. "They liked it very much, though," declared the teller of the story. It felt just as if Killer of Enemies was having intercourse with them. They were almost unconscious with ecstasy, though really Killer of Enemies was doing nothing at all to them. It was the medicine that made them feel that way. When Killer of Enemies had come to them, the storyteller then concluded, they had had strong teeth with which they had eaten their victims. But this medicine destroyed their teeth entirely. And so we see how the great boy hero once upon a time domesticated the toothed vagina to its proper use. Now it must have occurred to the reader during the preceding review of a series of imprints that, although a number of the images discussed are no doubt impressed upon our open IRMs from without, certain others can be the products only of the nervous structure itself. For where in the world would the cannibal ogress be? Or where the phallic mother and toothed vagina? Judging from the power of such images to release affects in children, as well as in many adults, we should call them sign stimuli of considerable force. Yet they are not in nature, but have been created by the mind. Whence then? Whence the images of nightmare and of dream? Perhaps a suggestive analogy is to be seen in the case of the grayling moth, which prefers darker mates to those actually offered by its present species. For if human art can offer to a moth the supernormal sign stimulus to which it responds more eagerly than to the normal offerings of life, it can surely supply supernormal stimuli also to the IRMs of man, and not only spontaneously in dream and nightmare, but even more brilliantly in the contrived folk tales, fairy tales, mythological landscapes, over and underworlds, temples and cathedrals, pagodas and gardens, dragons, angels, gods, and guardians of popular and religious art. It is true, of course, that the culturally developed formulations of these wonders have required in many cases centuries, even millenniums, to complete. But it is also true, and this, I believe, is what the present review is showing, that there is a point of support for the reception of such images in the déjà vu of the partially self-shaped and self-shaping mind. In other words, whereas in the animal world, the isomorphs, or inherited stereotypes, of the central nervous structure, which for the most part match the natural environment, may occasionally contain possibilities of response unmatched by nature, the world of man, which is now largely the product of our own artifice, represents, to a considerable extent at least, an opposite order of dynamics, namely, that of a living nervous structure and controlled response system fashioning its habitat, and not vice versa, but fashioning it not always consciously, by any means. Indeed, for the most part, or at least for a very considerable part, fashioning it impetuously out of its own self-produced images of rage and fear. A fifth culminating syndrome of imprints of this kind, mixed of outer and inner impacts, is that of the long and variously argued Oedipus complex. which according to the orthodox Freudian school is normally established in the growing child at the age of about 5 or 6, and thereafter constitutes the primary constellating pattern of all impulse, thought and feeling, imaginative art, philosophy, mythology and religion, scientific research, sanity and madness. The claim for the universality of this complex has been vigorously challenged by a number of anthropologists. For example, Bronislaw Malinowski, who in his work Sex and Repression in Savage Society declares, "The crux of the difficulty lies in the fact that to psychoanalysts the Oedipus complex is something absolute, the primordial source, the fons et origo of everything. I cannot conceive of the complex as the unique source of culture, of organization and belief," he goes on then to say, "as the metaphysical entity, creative but not created, prior to all things and not caused by anything else." Geza Roheim, on the other hand, replied in defense of Freud in a strong rebuttal, to which, as far as I know, there has been no response. However, since our problem for the present is not that of the ultimate force or extent in time and space of this imprint, but that simply of the possibility of its derivation from infantile experience, we may say that whether it is quite as universal as strict Freudians believe, or significantly modified in force and character, according to the sociology of the tribe or family in question, the fact remains that at about the age of 5 or 6, the youngster becomes implicated imaginatively, in our culture world at least, in a ridiculous tragicomedy that we may term the family romance. In its classical Freudian structuring, this Oedipal romance consists in the more or less unconscious wish of the boy to eliminate his father, Jack the Giant Killer motif, and be alone with his mother, but with a correlative fear, which is also more or less unconscious, of punishing castration by the father. And so here at last the imprint of the father has entered the psychological picture of the growing child, in the way of a dangerous ogre. As Roheim represents the case in his study of the psychology of primitive warfare, the father is the first enemy, and every enemy is symbolic of the father. Indeed, whatever is killed becomes father. Hence, certain aspects of the headhunting rites, to which we shall presently be turning, hence, too, the rites of the Paleolithic hunters in connection with the killing and eating of their totem beasts. For the girl, the corresponding Freudian formula is that of the legend of Electra. She is her mother's rival for the father's love, living in fear that the ogress may kill him and draw herself back into the web of the nightmare of that pre-sexual cannibal feast, formerly paradise, of the Bambino and Madonna. For times have changed, and it is now the little girl herself who is to play the Madonna to a brood of dolls. Since the following chapters furnish abundant instances of this romance of a Lilliputian and 2 giants, we need not pause to document it here, but observe simply that one example has already been supplied in the episode of Killer of Enemies, the boy hero, Kicking Monster, the father ogre, and the 4 vagina girls, who are dangerous in the father's service, but susceptible of domestication. 4 is a ritual number in American Indian lore, referring to the 4 directions of the universe, and appears in this story because the figures have no personal or historical, but rather a cosmic mythological reference. The girls are personifications of an aspect of the mystery of life. And so finally, To conclude this brief sketch of the Freudian notion of the family romance and its variations, the reaction of the very young male who vaguely senses that his mother is a temptress, seducing his imagination to incest and parricide, may be to hide his feelings from his own thoughts by assuming the compensatory negative attitude of a Hamlet, a mental posture of excessive submission to the jurisdiction of the father, atonement theme, together with a fierce rejection of the female and all the associated charms of the world, the fleshpots of Egypt, whore of Babylon, etc. Yea, from the table of my memory I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, all saws of books, all forms, all pressures past, that youth and observation copied there, and thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain, unmixed with baser matter, yes, by heaven. O most pernicious woman! O villain, villain, smiling damned villain! Here we are on the way to the worship of the omnipotent Father alone, monkdom, Puritanism, Platonism, celibate clergies, homosexuality, and all the rest. And there is much of this, too, to be found in the chapters to come. For as long as the nuclear unit of human life has been a man, woman, and child, the maturing consciousness has had to come to a knowledge of its world through the medium of this heavily loaded, biologically based triangle of love and aggression, desire and fear, dependency, command, and the urge for release. It is a kooky mold competent to shape the most recalcitrant dough. So that even should it finally be shown somehow that the human nervous system is without innate form, we should still not be surprised to find in all mythology an order of sign stimuli derived from the engrams of these inevitables. So that concludes section 3 of chapter 2. Thank you for joining me. Hope you have a wonderful day.